Okay, I'm Daniela Ruffolo. I am a 7th grade English language arts teacher at Scullin Middle School.
Great. Okay, so starting off, we want to understand the decisions you made in planning for this lesson and how it fits into the unit and year. First question, how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it?
Okay, so Unit 2 is primarily focused on the concept of acceptance and rejection. And the students have read an anchor text called What Do We Do with a Variation prior at the beginning of this unit. And they have now been working on close reading for a couple. They've had a couple sessions of it from first quarter on. And it really takes a look at, specifically with Temple Grandin and what we did in class, it focused on annotations and how to do annotations because it's something they're not really used to doing. They are really looking at more non-fiction, informational pieces. And a lot of what they're doing is basically reading multiple texts. They're trying to connect all the texts together based on this unit theme and trying to analyze and annotate for that purpose. So a lot of what we've been doing so far this quarter has been starting to look at those anchor texts, and where we're going from here is kind of taking a deeper look into Temple Grandin, not necessarily to know more about her, but using that piece as a way of them getting the nonfiction skills of just reading a complex text.
Good. Next portion of that question, discuss the sequence of lessons that surround this one lesson. So again, discuss the sequence of lessons that surround this one lesson.
Okay, just before, the day before this particular lesson, we had looked at the piece once through, kind of had the students read the article itself without any highlighting, without any annotations, and just did a read through because the students are often quick to highlight way too much information. So we've been practicing just kind of reading it through, figuring out what is the main piece, what is the most important thing about this text, what's the main idea, because that's often difficult to do when you're unfamiliar with the text. And the day before we read through it, we worked on just main idea. So looked at who, what, when, where, why, how, and just annotated for that piece. Kind of worked in small groups with some of our lower students so they felt a little more comfortable with the text. The day after this lesson, we focused specifically on the post-its of evidence they had pulled to support the claim that we had up on the board, and talked about what is good evidence, what evidence was helpful and maybe meaningful, but maybe not the strongest, because they have to do a lot of that in their writing naturally. So it helps to kind of just look through and say, okay, what was that strongest piece of evidence that you would have maybe put in a paper had you had to do a writing assignment on it? I think that's it.
Okay, good. Next question is the text used in this lesson part of a sequence of text designed to build skills and knowledge? If so, please give example of other texts that form this sequence.
Okay, so specifically this text was in a sequence of 3 close reads that we do throughout the entire unit. We do about 3 a unit with a nonfiction piece. So prior to this lesson, we had already done 1 close read of Temple Grandin. We still have 1 that we'll do later on this quarter. But as far as the skills, it's more about taking a look at how to do the annotations and looking at the deeper reading questions, things that the students maybe wouldn't pick up on necessarily the first time through. As far as the whole sequence of the unit, they really are spending a lot of time just pulling all these different texts together, and in different formats as well. So they might be looking at paintings, they might be listening to Cats in the Cradle is one song that we kind of analyze and kind of tie in with a theme. They're reading a lot of short stories, little by little. What Do We Do with a Variation, which is the anchor text. They're also doing primary lessons. So we pull in a lot of media, a lot of different formats of text, and really try to get them to focus on that theme of the unit and see it in different lights so they can pull from different examples.
Okay. Talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
I'm going to take a second to look at my notes on this one. Looks like I wrote it down. There were so many. And of course, who knows where I put it? Okay. As far as the standards hit in this lesson, a lot of it was focused around just using that text evidence, pulling information from the text, giving the students an opportunity to really depend on the text to respond to what they were thinking, instead of just kind of coming up with an answer off the top of their heads, which they're very quick to do. They're intelligent. They've learned how to cope in that way. But I think that the lesson was really focused on kind of analyzing for theme, analyzing that central idea. And they also had to use various texts, which is something I think is new with Common Core. Instead of focusing on, okay, what happened just in this text, it's asking for that comparison piece with other texts as well, which I think Common Core is really strong on. So.
Which of the core action indicators do you think the lesson best exemplifies, and why?
I would say core action 2 was probably best exemplified in this lesson. I really do think that the kids, in both the fan and pick activity and the group discussion questions, they really didn't have a chance to kind of just think off the top of their head as far as what a response would have been. So even with the fan and pick discussion, the students had to kind of take some time independently first, which I planned on purpose, because fan and pick is typically one of those activities where it's kind of think off the top of your head and what are you thinking about this response? But I really wanted them to be prepared with their answers and have the ability to depend on text. And in that moment when they're asked a question and they only think they have about 5 seconds to answer it, they kind of sit in silence and then jump out with an answer instead of really going back into the text and pulling it out. So specifically with that activity, I structured that on purpose, where they basically had a few minutes to look through the text and kind of formulate their answers already in their minds before they actually shared it with their group members.
We're interested in how the shifts required by the CCSS are being incorporated into your instruction. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
I would say, as far as the shifts in Common Core, I think a little bit of all of them were included in the lesson. I really think that the higher level text is something that the students are kind of challenged by. And I think the lower level students appreciate the challenge. The higher students are the ones who sometimes struggle because they're used to it being very easy for them. But I think the text levels were all appropriate, Lexile and Flesch-Kincaid score to the lesson. They also, as far as the second shift with text complexity, with text evidence, that was the primary focus of the lesson, just pulling information from there. The group discussion question sheet that they had a lot of questions on it, but a lot of it was focused back onto what was happening in the text. What can you gather from the text? And I think the students realized that. I think as I was watching them around the room, they were really focused on where did you find this? Where did I hear that before? So they did go back and jump to the text. I'm blanking for a second, sorry.
They jumped back on the text.
They jumped back on the text. I feel like I wrote something about this.
Where they're locating information.
Yeah. I was trying to think of the third shift. I was thinking core actions, but that's not the question I'm looking at. I am so sorry.
That's okay.
I have no idea where I wrote this. It's like one of those things, like I know I wrote about this last night,
Right.
and I don't know where this question is right now.
We can come back to it. Let's,
Okay.
we'll go to the second one in the shifts, and then we'll see if it just kind of addresses it.
Okay.
How did you teach the content of this lesson or the text prior to the CCSS? What is the same and what is different?
Okay, this lesson and this text actually weren't in my curriculum last year. We are at the 7th grade at Scullin piloting this year, the new Common Core. I shouldn't say, with the Common Core standards, a new curriculum. So this is a text that I was unfamiliar with. But I do see the connection to Common Core, and I do see how, it's got the nonfiction piece, it does have the text evidence piece, it's a little bit higher level, and then also having them rope in other texts to kind of respond to some of their questions was connected to the standards.
Student engagement is crucial to the work of the CCSS. We want to understand how you ensured that all students had the opportunity to productively engage in the work of the lesson. How did you support all students in working with grade level text? For example, how did you provide scaffolding for students below grade level so they can read grade level text?
Okay. I know as I speak to other staff members, it's kind of scary to think for those lower level students, how do you prepare students to read some of these more difficult texts? I think with nonfiction, sometimes it becomes a little easier when the vocabulary isn't as challenging, in the sense of they can kind of relate because it's realistic fiction, so they can tell with a true story, what is supposed to happen or what's going to happen. But I think sometimes as teachers, I used to think, well, I need to show them a video or I need to describe to them what autism is in order for them to fully understand the concept. And I think that was something we did have a conversation about, but I didn't kind of prep them with it like I used to. I think that's a change. I kind of jumped right into one of the first sections of Temple Grandin and kind of let them analyze, what's going on here, because they could naturally develop questions about it, regardless of the level of learning that they're at. I know specifically with this piece, the day before, I had worked with a lower group to just kind of work through the annotations, kind of have them think out loud to show me where they were at as far as their understanding and their comprehension of the text. And I think that's the best way to start supporting them, just as they're reading, kind of working with them, because I think that gives them a little more confidence going into, what we saw on the next day, day 2, when they're answering questions. If they feel like, oh, okay, I kind of got the gist of what the text was about, it's a little bit easier and more comfortable for them to engage in that discussion. But a lot of it is just kind of the prep work, and catching them where they might not be completely understanding. And I often see that through writing, because those days of comprehension tests and just multiple choice questions are pretty much gone. So we've been doing a lot of kind of through writing, show me what you know, and that's where a lot of the times I can spot the student missed a concept that they really should have gotten, and then you kind of step in from there and kind of bridge that gap a little bit.
Second part of the question is how did you create opportunities for students who are advanced to engage more deeply with grade level or above grade level text?
For some of the higher learners, I do pair them up with sometimes students who maybe need that coaching. That puts them in a little bit of a different position, because sometimes they're the kids who can better explain more than the teacher what's going on. During the post activity, which I did the next day for this lesson, the students who are the higher learners were the ones who kind of led the discussion about what was the best text evidence. We kind of charted and categorized, from best to worst, what that evidence looked like that they had already selected. We also completed kind of a sorting activity, and they were just the group leaders as far as kind of organizing and basically the stack of pictures and cards and quotes that they had. And it was kind of, I didn't tell them how to organize it. All of them had to do with acceptance and rejection, and most of them picked up on that. But it was pretty interesting to see the different perspectives as they kept working, because some of them had kind of some different ideas of what that acceptance and rejection looked like, and categorized them in a pretty creative way.
How do you know the students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision?
In looking at their responses, I could tell the students who had grasped the concepts and maybe who had missed a few. It was nice to be able to just walk around the room and listen to their conversation, because you had the natural group leaders who would just stand out, and they would want to be heard. They wanted to share their answers, and they wanted to make sure the teacher heard them. But it was also good to kind of kneel down next to them and ask, and maybe kind of target some of those students who were a little more quiet or reserved, to kind of say, okay, well, what do you think? And most of the time they were able to pull out that information. Looking through their group discussion questions later on after that class period, they really did a good job overall of picking specific information. But as I was looking at some of the questions, I saw where maybe a few groups fell apart, and it was easier the next day to have that conversation of, okay, well, what did we miss on this? Or did you really use text evidence on this one, or where did you find it? But the cool thing about it was I had students coming up to me saying, I'm not quite sure that this was in the text, and one of our group members did not really know where to find it. Says she found it, but we can't find it, so I'm not sure if we should use this piece of information. So I thought it was kind of cool that the kids themselves were questioning each other and just thinking about, hey, I didn't see that in the text. Maybe we need to go back and kind of do this part again. So that was kind of cool for me to see.
Let's see, back on this one. Did students acquire the literary skills addressed in the lesson?
I think the students did acquire the literary skills addressed overall. I mean, I think in the few groups that I looked at their discussion questions, if they did make an error, it was maybe on one, or maybe they just need a little elaboration on one other piece. But in verbally asking them that, in the days following, they were able to recall and tell me the information. It might have been just them being lazy and not writing it all down. But I also realized too, personally, as I was reflecting, that the way I had written all the questions, some of those questions had 5 or 6 parts to them, which is kind of a lot, especially for some of the lower readers. And even though it was modified for them and the questions were a little more simple, even though they were getting at the same point, it seemed like those students were a little more successful when they only had a question or two to focus on, compared to 5 or 6 different pieces of a question.
Going on to, I think we're still in this group. Okay. What behaviors from core action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson? What actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen?
I know core action 3 is all about having access to the text. And I think spacing it out in a few days of a lesson the way we did was helpful, because if they weren't able to get it through a first read, they had multiple times to look through that lesson, through that piece, that article specifically, to kind of gain some understanding. And we talk about how, even when you watch a movie, you watch it the first time, you don't pick up on everything, but every time you might pick up on a funny joke or something that's happening on the background that you didn't catch the first time. So we read that article the first time the day before, just a clean read, no marking annotations, none of that. And then that same day, they had to reread and highlight for just key ideas. They took a third look at it the day of the lesson, and through that, with some specific focus questions through the fan and pick activity, I think they knew kind of what I was getting at. With When a Door Opens. When we came back to No Girls Allowed, that was their third look at that article, and just taking a few minutes to kind of comb through it, really with the focus of that whole theme concept of acceptance and rejection. I really think that they were able to, for the third time, pick up on some things that maybe the first time they weren't looking at, because they were just looking for the key idea. So I think the elements of having them write about it, have them read about it, and then also they had to discuss about it was a really good way for all of the students, regardless of their abilities, to kind of have access to that text and gain some understanding.
Would you like to comment on any of the students' submitted work? Was there something that delighted or surprised you with this work?
In looking at the student responses, I was happy overall with how much they depended on the text. There were a few, as I mentioned before, there were a few questions that I noticed in the series of maybe 5 that some of them skipped, and it probably wasn't intentional. It was just so many things that I was asking them to look at. But overall, I think they really did a good job. There was nothing that was too shocking on there. Sorry.
Yeah. Great instructors are continuously learning. We want to understand what you celebrated in this lesson and what you would improve upon. Reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well and what might you do differently?
I like the element of them working as a group. And I debated about this even prior to the lesson. Should I have them work in pairs? Because they might have had a little more voice in the activity, so that might be something I might have done differently. But what I was thinking about the majority of the time was how long the kids were sitting and not moving. That was my one piece that I thought, if I could change something, I would have maybe broken down the activities. Maybe I would have read When a Door Opens the day before, just to not have all of those texts in one day, because I do feel like they were sitting for a long time. But I do think that it was beneficial to have a little bit of the discussion and then have a little more discussion as far as writing the group responses. Because having them do that independently, I think, would have been a little overwhelming, especially for a student who's a little lower or weaker in their abilities. I know the sorting card activity I had planned for the end, and then I kind of thought about, well, maybe that would have been a good break in between the texts to just kind of get up, work on the sorting activity. I just felt like sometimes it maybe would deter from the whole point of the lesson since they were so focused on what they were reading about. But overall, I would say that would be my biggest need for change, would just be just a little more movement in some way, because it was a long time for them to sit and focus. It probably took about 35 minutes or so for them to go through those group discussion questions. And while they were all pretty much on task, it was just a long time to be sitting and thinking for a 12 or 13-year-old child. So.
Good. Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
Overall, they were really well behaved. I think the cameras kind of scared them, but no. I think student behavior was overall what I expected. I did have one student that you probably noticed in the back corner who she was struggling at one point to respond to the group questions. And I think it's because she had stated something and didn't really feel like that answer had been accepted, so she kind of went into a shutdown mode. And which is not atypical, for her behavior, but I think it was a little difficult, especially in the moment with just kind of the scene and how the classroom was set up that day, that she struggled to kind of get back on track. And we were able to finish up those questions the next day, and we talked about, the responsibilities of everybody contributing to the group and, what that looks like. And I think that helped day 2, but I think in the moment, she was a little bit stressed that day. So that was the only atypical behavior I think I noticed.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thanks.